Thank you all for coming to our first lecture of this academic year, the first lecture in our counterculture series. And it is with real delight and pleasure that I welcome Professor Joan Ockman, with whom I actually share some passions for growing herbs and other things that we've shared in the past, back to our school, this time as the first lecture of the year. And the program, as many of you know, is focused this year around critique and institutional critique, and this semester in particular on design education, an interest which kind of mirrors the fact that our school is now in its 50th year. So I first really became aware of Joan's work through her treasure trove of a book that's called Architecture Culture, 1943 to 1968. And I think that the appearance of that book in 1993 led many of my colleagues who were grad students at the time to pursue doctoral research in the post-war era, and resulted in the publication of many other books that now have become familiar. And what is really memorable about that anthology to me is not just that it assembled documents under a cover, but that each document was so carefully ensconced in a crafted commentary, and that commentary situated the theoretical concerns in a historical context. So this task is one that Professor Ockman began already in her role at the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies, where she was the associate editor of the influential journal Oppositions, and also the executive editor of Oppositions books. And this concern is also apparent in her many publications on the history, theory, and criticism of both modern and contemporary architecture, and for which she was also named Fellow of the Society of Architectural Historians. She received an award for a lifetime of significant contributions, though I would say that her lifetime has not yet been achieved. Nonetheless, she's taught for over 2 decades at Columbia, and even taught some of us there. And she was the director of the multifaceted program run by the Temple Hoyne Buell Center for the study of American architecture for some 14 years. Now, she's the distinguished senior lecturer at Penn. She also is a visiting professor at Cooper and at Cornell, and I cannot imagine what her travel schedule must look like. And we've invited her today because we were inspired by her book on the architecture school that was published by MIT Press in 2012, which is a fascinating companion piece to her book that came out before that on the subject of making. So these texts all demonstrate the scope of Joan's research and reflection into architectural education on these shores. And this leads us to her focus today on the status of research in architectural institutions. And we're so delighted that she's here. So please join us in welcoming Joan Ockman.
Thanks so much, Hadas. It's a real pleasure to be back here in Buffalo, where I had the privilege of being Clarkson chair, I guess about 12 years ago. And just coming back and riding around town a little bit with Hadas brought back some very nice memories. I really appreciated your introduction. Thanks so much again. So the talk that I'm about to give was prompted by a short piece that I wrote a couple years ago for this online platform called eFlux Architecture. And it was an attempt to think about architectural research and the way architectural research has become such a thing in architecture schools today. And it was a rather critical piece. After it was published, I was accused of demonizing architectural research. And so I've now sort of backtracked a little bit and want to put the subject of research, architecture research, into a historical context before working my way back up to the present and thinking about how research has changed in architecture education over the years. And I'm especially talking about American architectural education, but I think there's actually, it's more broad than just the US or US and Canada. I think this is really a phenomenon that we're seeing that is global these days. So it also turns out that thinking about the history of architectural research, architectural educational research, is a useful way to revisit the history of architecture education. So I hope that this snapshot of research going back to the 19th century will, in a way, give you a capsule history of American architecture education. But I'd like to start because it's the centennial of the Bauhaus this year. Bauhaus was founded, as you may know, in 1919. It's being celebrated pretty widely this year all over the place. So I thought I'd start with these two pedagogical figures who were at the Bauhaus, Johannes Itten and Laszlo Moholy-Nagy. And Itten was the founding master of the preliminary course. He was there at the inception of the school, invited by the director, Walter Gropius, to give the course in fundamentals, or to invent the course in fundamentals for the school, which he did for about 3 years until he kind of got kicked out and replaced by Moholy-Nagy. And as you can see just from these two portraits, they're very different personas. Itten being the kind of high priest or even a kind of shaman figure who famously had his students do these exercises based on this cult or sect called Mazda's Nan that he was a member of, that came from India, having them do exercises at the beginning of studio. He was a vegetarian and he had other sort of life practices that he inculcated at the school. At the same time, he also was a fairly rigorous theoretician, specifically of color, and the course that he developed as this kind of introduction to the school, the course that absolutely every student had to take upon entry, became a foundation stone for all the education that is associated with has been associated with modern architecture since. But his replacement by Moholy-Nagy, who, as you see, also has his own sort of persona, the technician, the laboratory man, the scientist almost cum artist, a humanist, but one whose approach to architecture and to design pedagogy was much more in the nature of a rigorous scientific approach than an artistic one. He considered himself to be an artist, but one who was very much a rational thinker, and reflecting the major shift that took place at the Bauhaus right around 1922-23 from its arts and crafts beginnings to art and industry, which is the Bauhaus that everybody tends to think about, but actually not where the school began. In any case, this comparison just of these two portraits always makes me think of a famous passage from this essay by Walter Benjamin, maybe his most famous essay, The Work of Art in the Age of its Technological Reproducibility, and where Benjamin is drawing a contrast between two kinds of thinking, of visual thinking really, that of a painter and that of a filmmaker. And of course, cinema cinematography is a new medium entering into the modern world in by the date, well before actually, already earlier in the century. But in any case, Benjamin draws this interesting distinction between the surgeon and the magician. So you can read with me here. The surgeon represents the polar opposite of the magician. The attitude of the magician, who heals a sick person by a laying on of hands, differs from that of the surgeon, who makes an intervention in the patient. The magician maintains the natural distance between himself and the person treated. More precisely, he reduces it slightly by laying on his hands, but increases it greatly by his authority. The surgeon does exactly the reverse. He greatly diminishes the distance from the patient by penetrating the patient's body and increases it only slightly by the caution with which his hand moves among the organs. Magician is to surgeon as painter is to cinematographer. The painter maintains in his work a natural distance from reality, whereas the cinematographer penetrates deeply into its tissue. The images obtained by each differ enormously. So I think we're dealing with more than different sort of styles of work and different personalities, but with whole different ways of seeing. And maybe we can keep these two examples in mind for some of what we're going to see now. So, a brief history of research in architecture education. Many of the images I'm about to show you are published in my book, Architecture School. Not all, but you can find them there. So there's a running dispute about what was the first American architecture school. And the claimants are, respectively, MIT and Illinois Industrial University. And it depends on whether you are judging in terms of who founded their program first, that was MIT, or who graduated their first student, and that was Illinois Industrial University. Here you can see the first class there with the important Nathan Ricker at the center, a young man who would dominate that school for about 4 decades. And the men, and they're all men at this moment, okay, are portrayed with the tools of their trade, of their education. And their education at this date is in architectural engineering. Architecture in the second third of the 19th century, or after the Civil War anyway, is very much ensconced in polytechnical schools or industrial universities. And these kinds of universities are a result of a very important law that was a federal law that was signed into law by none other than Abraham Lincoln in 1862, establishing a system of land-grant universities in the United States. And what the land-grant universities did was that they earmarked federal lands for purposes of universities, of founding schools, and they were geared to a population that was in those days primarily agricultural, but was beginning to industrialize pretty rapidly. So Illinois Industrial, which would become the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, was one of those land-grant schools. So Nathan Ricker basically had worked as a blacksmith before entering the school as a pretty young kid. And when he graduated, he went to Berlin and enrolled in the Polytechnical University there. And as I just said, the polytechnical schools in Europe that were especially in Germany, in Austria, but also having background in France, were very much the dominant form of architecture education. And Ricker came back from Europe infused with that kind of thinking. thinking and would implement it in the program of the school. And here you see the course catalog in 1872, which reflects this now new branch of learning called architectural engineering. And in addition to this polytechnical background, which meant a form of education that was very much rooted in science and closely connected with civil engineering, also started to take on some new American inflection, in particular, a kind of hands-on approach to things. So, for example, the shop became very important at Illinois Industrial University, and you can see how it's mentioned in the program there. What also develops in this context are these experiment stations, so-called. The first engineering experiment station is founded in 1903 with a federal grant of $150,000. And in these engineering stations, research was undertaken in a wide variety of fields, from acoustics to concrete materials research to even, in the case of Ricker himself, who was responsible for writing one of these reports or bulletins, a way of classifying architectural knowledge integrated into the Dewey Decimal System. That's what this what you're looking at here. So research is part of the kind of polytechnical approach to architecture education or architectural engineering education, and it's kind of where the research aspect of our form of education gets going. We see it developing in other contexts. Cornell is also founded pretty early, and in this plate you see construction details by a student, Robert Eidlitz, the nephew of the more famous Leopold Eidlitz, who was a German emigre who had studied in Austrian. I can't remember if he was Austrian or German initially, but anyway, he got his education at the Vienna Polytechnic, and again, the kind of combination of a more material and pragmatic approach to thinking with a research and scientifically rational approach are starting to come together. Okay, so the polytechnical model remained the dominant one in architecture education in this country up to around the 1890s, when it was overtaken by the Beaux-Arts, by the École des Beaux-Arts. And early figures, including Richardson and also Richard Morris Hunt, were among the first American students to attend the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, came back, in the case of Hunt, founded an atelier in New York City where he proceeded to teach on the Beaux-Arts model. Beaux-Arts model was not research-oriented in the way we've just been talking about it, and yet history was, of course, a very big concern for the Beaux-Arts architect, who, after all, was learning how to design in a way that emulated the great examples from history. And at a school like Columbia, which is founded on a Beaux-Arts model, the library early on starts to become an important place, and historical research is undertaken by important professors there, including Alfred Hamlin and his better-known son Talbot Hamlin, who kind of divided their own time between teaching in the school and doing historical research. So we have another kind of facet of research that we see that's coming by way of the Beaux-Arts. The Beaux-Arts model would, as I said, overtake the Polytechnic, eclipse it, and really prevail in the United States almost up to World War II. But some alternatives were also already beginning to emerge. Landscape architecture was one aspect of the study of architecture where you even see women were part of the student body early on. And here at Berkeley, we can see how surveying exercises, measuring and really doing field work, literally, was understood to be a necessity as part of training. Or preservation, historic preservation, pretty early on too, is now taking on board research as a necessary part of its pedagogy. But modern architecture is beginning to make its way into the United States, and it really will be in the 1930s when you get the diaspora of architects from Europe coming to this country and setting themselves up in important schools that we get the major infusion of modernism into the American context. But there are a few figures that come earlier, and Richard Neutra is one of them, following his compatriot Rudolf Schindler out to the West Coast. Schindler had come earlier. And Neutra founds a very short-lived school of his own in 1928. It only lasts for about a year and a half, but you can see the announcement for it here. And what Neutra did was, and Neutra was very inspired by American construction methods, and was interested in teaching them to his students. And the way he taught was by bringing his students to building sites, in particular the Lovell House, which he was at that point involved in working on. And so again, that kind of combination of hands-on or pragmatic or designing and building somehow understood together is part of his thinking in relation to this practical course in modern building art. Whether this is research or not, it seems to me somehow bound up with a new kind of rational thinking about how to learn or how to teach architecture. On the right, it comes a bit later, although I just like to kind of juxtapose these two images. This is a page from Paul Rudolph's undergraduate thesis at Alabama Polytechnic Institute, 1940. So this is one of those polytechnical, those land grant schools I was talking about earlier that is still very much going in 1940 when Rudolph entered it. And so we get this thesis project as a new site for research by students. And from here, Rudolph would go to Harvard, to the GSD, where Walter Gropius was now the head of the architecture department, and his career would take off from there. But interesting to see this early moment when he was a student at Alabama Polytechnic. Again, in the 30s, we have this now new winds are sort of blowing from Europe into the United States. rationalism, functionalism, all the ideology of modern architecture is beginning to make its appearance. 1932, as you probably know, is the famous International Style show at MoMA. But also at the same time, this is the New Deal era, the 30s, when there is crisis in terms of housing and urban the cities, and so architecture education starts to take on new projects that require research. And Albert Farwell Bemis, who was a graduate of MIT, would establish a foundation for the study of prefabricated housing at MIT. He would be a philanthropist, in other words, in setting up this new institute, and it would, in addition to his own series of books called Rational Housing, a 3-volume series, The Evolving House, the work would be undertaken in the context of that institute for years to come. So, as I just said, we have the Bauhaus figures who are now making their appearance in the United States. Joseph Albers is the first to arrive, and he goes to Black Mountain College down in North Carolina. And then comes Gropius to Harvard, followed by Moholy-Nagy to the School of Design, a school whose name would change to the Institute of Design and ultimately would get folded into IIT, but in any case starts out as a School of Design in 1937, and Moholy sets out to kind of reconstitute a Bauhaus education in an American context. And we can see that this sort of laboratory conception of architecture is now being translated into this Chicago school. Interesting apropos of the Bauhaus that in the initial phase, that Itten phase I was talking about, the Bauhaus is set up in workshops. The workshop is the kind of unit that students join, not studios, not ateliers, but workshops. But the shift in the metaphor or the reality from a workshop to a laboratory is one that is, I think, telling, revealing, and by the time we get to the new Bauhaus School of Design in Chicago, this sort of laboratory atmosphere is part of what Moholy still insists is a humanistic form of education. He's very interested in an organic or holistic idea of architecture, and indeed he sent his students to the University of Chicago, where the disciples of John Dewey and American pragmatism were teaching, and so there was that interchange. But the setup of the school was very much in this kind of research mode or laboratory mode. We also, in the case of a lesser known school, but very similar in conception, the Laboratory School of Industrial Design being a new discipline that begins to take off in the 1930s, also setting itself up in terms of labs. Here you have student projects from the materials lab, as you see. And then some other, as I say, more kind of alternative thinking, experimental, innovative kinds of thinking about teaching architecture and the kind of research work that might be undertaken within the context of an architecture school, now one that sees itself as modernist and very much antithetical to the Beaux-Arts model. So Friedrich Kiesler, another Austrian emigre, establishing this this laboratory for design correlation at Columbia, which lasted for a few years, where he undertook a project like this one for a vision machine, so experimenting with issues of visual perception and experience, and so that starting to open up a whole new territory of design research. So design itself now becoming the subject of research, design being the core of the architecture education, but now being kind of combined with a research orientation to that. During World War II, a lot of architects were basically sitting on their hands. There was no work to be had. There were no buildings being constructed. But in schools, various teachers, including at Moholy Naj's school in Chicago, Georgi Kepish, and also at Pratt in New York, Konrad Wittmann, doing work with their students on camouflage design. And this was actually called the Industrial Camouflage Laboratory, and in other words, trying to aid the war effort through research projects like this one. And Kepish was doing very similar work out at the Institute of Design during the war. Of course, World War II would also be a very important moment for the development of R&D, research and development of new methodologies, new materials, and so forth, and that would filter into architecture as well, as we'll see in a second. But even before that, here is an early bubble diagram made by an architect named Percy Nobbs, somebody who was teaching up at McGill, and now really thinking about architecture as problem solving, redefining the field from design and kind of creative or aesthetic operation to problem solving, at least when it came to trying to construct a residential plan. So Gropius at Harvard it had a different context to adapt to than Moholy did in Chicago. Moholy's school was small, so more similar in scale to what the Bauhaus was in its various iterations in Germany, although Chicago, of course, was a very different kind of city from Weimar and Dessau and Berlin, the three locations where the Bauhaus lived its life from 1919 till it was shut down by the Nazis in 1933. But in any case, it was possible for Moholy to redo the Bauhaus setup, its organization in Chicago in a much more faithful way than Gropius was able to do at Harvard. Harvard, after all, was a huge institution, had a whole other prestige and base, and so, and Gropius came in as the dean of the architecture program, or the chair, I should say, of the architecture school, not the dean of the entire graduate school of design. That was a man named Joseph Hudnut, who actually brought Gropius, but he had rather different ideas from Gropius, and the two of them started to come into conflict pretty soon after Gropius arrived. And so while Gropius wanted, right from his arrival in 1937, to have that preliminary or foundation course that had been established and so successful at the Bauhaus launched at Harvard, Hudnut blocked him from that. But eventually, kind of late in Gropius's tenure, because he would step down shortly after this, he was able to hire this man, Richard Filipowski, to do something like it. But already what we can see looking at this project for an urban design studio in the late 40s, or in these diagrams that of Filipowski's program, studio program, a certain kind of transformation of the spirit of the Bauhaus, the original spirit, under the rubric of design research, into a kind of formularizing thing, into what one of the critics of Gropius's school would call a decorated diagram. So already we're starting to see a shift, a change in, again, the kind of sensibility or spirit of the earlier idea of design research in the GSD context. Again, coming out of World War II, this whole new structure of corporate and government patronage for schools, and architecture schools would try to get a piece of that. So research and development now being translated into the academic context and funded by corporations, if not by the government. Here you see a plate from this Unistrut school construction manual, which was a project at the University of Michigan College of Architecture and Design, where they built a full-scale mock-up of a school building using prefabricated components and published the results. Or back at Cornell, the well-known Cornell kitchen. Interesting to see that it's men who were building the Cornell kitchen, but this was a research project that went on for some years there as part of their housing research center. So we're in the 1950s here. Another significant figure, Konrad Wachsmann, also a German emigre who first came over. He had started out his career very much engaged with prefabrication in Germany, came to the US and partnered with Gropius during World War II on a wood house system. Wood was the only material that was available during the war years, so it had to be wood. But after that, and after kind of splitting with Gropius, he would go out to Chicago, to the Institute of Design, and be very much involved in designing systems for large-scale constructions like aircraft hangars, on which he worked for the United States Air Force, but in the context of the school. And he stated himself that he preferred the atmosphere of academia to being in the military or in some other context, because he liked working together with students on these kinds of projects. But in any case, this work at the kind of borderline between architecture and engineering was very innovative and extremely influential. And after leaving Chicago, he went out to University of Southern California and continued to do more of it. Bucky Fuller, another pedagogical figure on the scene during this post-war era, somebody who was peripatetic, never or not so much attached to one particular institution, but basically traveling all over the place like the Pied Piper, giving spellbinding hours-long lectures to architecture students, but also working with students to construct some of these projects that he was inventing. This was his geodesic period, and so students at different schools constructed projects of one kind or another with him. This is Washington University in St. Louis. So one year he'd be there, the next year he'd be at Yale, the next year he'd be in Illinois. He was all over the place doing this and had a very powerful effect this way. But again, it was actually designing it and building it and researching it. So all of these coming together in this, at this moment. So aesthetic research, or design research, I mean, back to Johannes Itten and his color theory. In addition to Moholy-Nagy taking over from Itten after he was forced out of the school because he was too much of a sort of mystical figure rather than a rational one for the direction that the Bauhaus had moved in by then, another figure who joined Moholy-Nagy in teaching that preliminary course was Josef Albers. And as I said, Albers comes to the US and he goes to Black Mountain College, a very experimental school. Bucky Fuller's down there too. And then from there he goes to Yale. And at Yale, one of his students was Robert Slutsky, who was my husband. And Slutsky would be in the art school, but his first job out of Yale Art School was at the University of Texas in Austin in the architecture school down there, a school that had just been revamped totally by a man named Harwell Hamilton Harris, and was interested in taking really a backwater school, a provincial school, and doing something more interesting, and managed to assemble a faculty that included the historian, architect historian Colin Rowe, the architect John Haydock, the Swiss architect Bernard Hosley, who had just come from working in Le Corbusier's office, having gotten interested in Frank Lloyd Wright, somehow found his way to Texas. Anyway, all these figures sort of meeting at the University of Texas in Austin in the mid-50s and constructing a new kind of pedagogical program there. Anyway, what you're looking at are two exercises by students of Slutsky's in color class, and very much, again, framed as a form of research, but now, again, research in the arena of aesthetics and design rather than in some other framework of science or engineering or whatever. Of course, again, just to sort of telescope how things change and move, after this episode in Texas, where this group down there of sort of maverick figures who were coming together from very different places and would form what was come to be called the Texas Rangers, after that all blew up because it was much too experimental and challenging for that school, so they all wound up coming back north and east after just a couple years down there. John Haydock would land at Cooper Union, bringing Slutsky there with him to teach, and Colin Rowe would end up at Cornell, and Hosley would go back to Switzerland, where he would be important figure at the ETH for years there. But in any case, the transformation of the pedagogy in Texas to Cooper Union involves a continuation of the project of formal or aesthetic research, but now literally packaged. This famous 9-square grid problem, which was invented down in Texas, would be transferred to a school like Cooper Union, where craft had always been a very important part of the outlook of the school. So exquisitely crafted kits of parts like this one by Lorna McNur, a student there, which involved a very rigorous incremental set of exercises in variations on this 9-square grid problem project. Meanwhile, yet another arena for research is the one that would be launched with Christopher Alexander's PhD thesis at the GSD. So Alexander, originally from Vienna, trained in mathematics, goes to London and comes from London to Harvard, where he would produce the first PhD dissertation in architecture, and it would end up as this book a couple years later, Notes on the Synthesis of Form. But you can thank Christopher Alexander for having introduced the computer into architecture as a problem-solving device. And Alexander's career would sort of take a different path later on, but in any case, in the context of this thesis that he did, obviously research is what it's all about. The computer is now going to be an instrument that will be mobilized for purposes of architectural research. We're in the 60s now, and so as a sort of very much a product of the 60s, this so-called think tank founded in New York City by Peter Eisenman with the help of his mentor, Colin Rowe, but also the Museum of Modern Art. So even though it's like we like to think about the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies as this kind of alternative education, it definitely had big institutional support to get off the ground. But in any case, interesting or important to note, apropos of the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies, IAUS, is the urban studies part, because initially in its founding in 1967, it was very much dedicated to urban research. We're in the 60s, as I said. You have a mayor in New York, a kind of liberal, progressive Republican mayor, John Lindsay, who is very much surrounding himself with the best and the brightest young architects and planners to deal with the big problems of urbanism of the city that were at hand. And so this early institute formation was also plugged into that, and you can see the blue cover up at the top is an early research study that was done on new towns, like the ones that were founded in England after the war, and so this booklet. But soon enough, by 1973, the Institute would launch its journal, which it's now well known for, Oppositions, and we would see a shift from that research orientation of the very beginning to theory and to history and to a new international neo-avant-garde that is emerging around the world. So a shift by the 1970s from the more scientific research orientation of the late 60s into something else. But other places, other things are happening, including at Berkeley, where we see this is MIT, and so what will become the Media Lab is already working on projects like this one by the Architecture Machine Group, this movie map, which again is now using the computer as an instrument for thinking about how you move around cities, and or at Berkeley, this laboratory, the Environmental Simulation Laboratory, still exists out there, I believe, where computer models are studying new imaging technologies, representation techniques that are being made available by computerization. All right, well, I've kind of gone through much of the 100-year history very, very rapidly, and I quickly want to kind of jump to the present, where we can see a virtual reality project by a thesis study at SciArc. We know that, robot labs and artificial intelligence laboratories and so forth are really the coin of the realm today. We're also at Columbia, for example, labs are again a metaphor for what everybody wants to be somehow part of. Last count, Columbia had about 14 of these labs, including a death lab. So the lab becomes almost a kind of cliche of architectural education in our time, and I'm going to come back to that in a moment. But before getting to my conclusion here, I just want to introduce one other component of this idea of research that has also become a major phenomenon in our own time. So the studio trip also is a research trip. And its beginnings include things like Aldo van Eyck, his journey to the sub-Sahara to look at the Dogon tribe in Africa and to very carefully photograph and immerse himself in a way of life that he admired greatly. Took him a long time to get there. He made a few excursions to Africa, only managing to get to Mali, the Dogon, in the 1960s. But a trip that was an immersion and a real serious exercise in seeing in a non-Western way things that he was very much committed to. And we can compare that to another kind of travel or trip, maybe, tourism of a certain kind that is represented by a famous show that the Museum of Modern Art staged in 1964, Architecture Without Architects, curated by another Viennese immigrant to the US, Bernard Rudowski, who basically with a series of very striking black and white images, kind of one to a site, put out a sort of amazing visual compendium of non-Western, non-pedigreed, as he calls it, architectures around the world, which certainly arrested people's attention. This show traveled, it was designed to travel, in fact, but it was a different kind of traveling than the one that Van Eyck had embarked on, immersed himself in. I mean, we know that travel is has a very long history in architecture education, from the Grand Tour early, where every architecture student had to make the journey to not just Rome, but Greece and farther east in the case of somebody like Le Corbusier. But in any case, by the 1960s and later, the destinations were changing. Certainly, they changed in 1968 with the Venturi's famous studio trip to Las Vegas. Think of it, we're 1968. 1968 is a year when basically all hell is breaking loose with the protests against the war in Vietnam, racial conflict, the counterculture. And where does this Yale studio go on its trip? They go to Las Vegas for whatever reason, but in any case, and they spend essentially 10 days out there, another 4 days in Los Angeles, come back and produce a book, right? So this is the moment when the studio trip, as I think we know it today in architecture schools, is really born. But again, I mean, we need to think about the nature of the trip. how things were really framed by the teachers, Venturi, Scott Brown, and Steve Eisenhower, for purposes of a studio project, a studio research project, which would be followed the following year by a Learning from Levittown studio and so forth. So anyway, this is a beginning point for our contemporary studio trips, and in a latter day version, we have a far more exotic destination, namely to Lagos, under the auspices of the Harvard Project on the City, something that Rem Koolhaas came to Harvard in the 90s, in the late 90s, and initiated. And again, the results of the trip are a book and 2 films in this particular case, and students are collaborating on this. It's not just Lagos, it's the Pearl River Delta in China and other, again, destinations. But by this point, the concept of research has been completely redefined or recalibrated, and Koolhaas is a very instrumental figure in all of this, because he has always, almost from the beginning, associated his own practice, his own work with research, and he made that formalize this relationship between work and practice in his own office in 1988, when he came up with this sort of mirror image of OMA and AMO, AMO being the research arm of the studio OMA. So the Koolhaas version of research would have very wide, important influence in our time, as I think you probably all know. And so this leads to my conclusion here, and I realize I'm going a bit long, so let me sort of hasten to my conclusion. In 2014, Rem became the director of the Biennale, and the main exhibition in the big space was this thing called Fundamentals. So we can think back to the Itten Foundation moment, and now Fundamentals in 2014 are really the sort of elements of architecture, but elements understood to be things like floors and walls and ceilings and elevators and ramps and so on, to which enormous space was devoted in the show, in which just copious research was produced, basically cataloging and exhibiting all this stuff. And here, being a little bit naughty or arch, you see a plate from the multi-volume catalog of this Fundamentals show, and makes me think of Mallarmé, but certainly in a totally different context. Everything in the world exists in order to become a book, or in order to become an exhibition. In other words, what is the purpose of this research that we're now carrying out and doing endlessly? What is motivating it, driving it, and what are we going to do with the knowledge that we get from it? So these fundamental questions, speaking of fundamentals, I think need to be posed to this new culture of research that we're seeing today. And I think I've already gone a long time. What I would have done was to read you just a little bit from this piece that I told you stirred up a little bit of trouble a couple of years ago, in which I suggested that what used to be, certainly in the 1970s and 80s, in architecture schools, a very vibrant history theory component of the architecture curriculum, today has, I think, morphed into or shifted toward a culture of research and curation. So the slash in history theory is now, I'm proposing become the research/curation operation that is taking place in many architecture schools. And of course, we need to analyze why that is happening. So there's this history that I've just gone through, but of course we're also talking about a moment when universities are being transformed under the neoliberal regime of contemporary capitalism and the effects of that on a culture of architecture that is now oriented to performance and production and less to self-reflection and self-critique. And in other words, what theory and history are good at doing is sort of slowing down, gumming up the works, producing friction by forcing us to think about our own operations in a intense way, for the most part, not always, but often, while research and curation tend to be more forward projected toward a future that is accelerating faster than we can think it. So I'll just end with that and just with a few questions about what you're doing in your research labs and why you're doing it, and maybe leave it there. Okay, thank you very much.
I'll sort of take over as sort of both a, sort of run the microphone around and maybe ask a question to sort of get the conversation started a bit. You mentioned that since that eFlux article and then the talks that you gave afterwards, you sort of had this really kind of punchy phrases that kind of got stuck with me too. Like you were talking about like value-free scholarship, value-neutral research, and then at the same time you were talking about sort of this research and curation as opposed to theory and criticism, and that because I bet we could all relate to it, especially when you're sort of talking about the evolution of this kind of neoliberal university. I guess. You kind of mentioned that sort of created this sort of reaction. Since then, have your views evolved a bit more? Like, is there some? Because I guess my question is, we're sort of at some point we're also kind of swimming against that tide. Sort of, there were other things that you talked about, like this sort of this grant-making landscape, for example, and this kind of entrepreneurial research attitude that we sort of are kind of adapting, maybe unconsciously. I don't know, maybe you probably had more conversations about it and got to reflect on it a little bit more. Perhaps you have some sort of takeaways that you could share with us.
Well, one thing I do want to emphasize, and should have said it, is that I am not trying to demonize research. I think research is very necessary, and as a historian myself, I mean, this is what I do research. On the other hand, I think we have to be aware of the fiction of scientific objectivity, of judgment neutral, that research often parades under. Research is always coming from somewhere, and we have to understand that, that motivation, the ideology that is behind it, who is funding it, things like that. So I'm by no means trying to discourage research in the realm of architecture education. I think research is essential. On the other hand, I think we need to reflect on what we're doing with our research and why we're doing it. Yeah. So
thank you very much for your talk. I wanted to maybe frame my question in relationship to some of the last images that you showed with the Koolhaas curation of the going back to fundamentals, and then a couple of cycles of the Chicago Biennial, with the new one sort of coming up now. And for me, it's really interesting sort of thinking about this turn towards both the collection of types as a kind of a way of thinking of research and cataloging things, where there isn't a kind of ideological frame for it, against what's happening now at the Chicago Biennial, where there's a collection as well, and there's a curation there, but it seems to be very pointed, very polemical, very critical of what it is that this very culture that you're talking about, this kind of display of visual novelty, or the display of collection of what you call site studies and this kind of pseudo-ethnographic intervention into a place without getting deep and understanding what the cultural trends are. And so I'm wondering if, because now we're starting to get the first couple of critiques of the Chicago Biennial, and some folks are like really disappointed that it's not prettier and that there's not a lot of beautiful things there. But then others who are saying that it broadens the audience of architecture and allows for folks like the mayor and local residents to talk to folks like architects and historians about things that are relevant to the city, the social life of the city, the racial demography of the city, lots of things that I think are interesting. And so I'm wondering if that would be a potential model of complicating the emptiness of some research, this kind of pseudo-laboratory research that you're talking about. And I don't know if you've gone to see the show or read the critiques, but to me it seems like they're struggling with the very thing that you're talking about here, that they're trying to provide content to this tendency to collect and display in a visually pleasing way that would please the architect's desire to see beautiful things, but in a way that also engages a kind of broader polemic.
Well, spectacle, the whole culture of spectacle is sort of double-edged. On the one hand, it's something that we can be very skeptical about, how images are being manipulated and how our own relationship to this imagery that we're being asked to, admire and be awed by. On the other, spectacles are engaging. They have an entertainment value. They maybe do draw in a wider audience, and maybe from the standpoint of a mass public, there is some virtue in being able to tap into everyday public and what they tend to think of when they think of the elements of a house or whatever it is. I'm not sure. And I actually I haven't been following whatever polemics are going on around the biennial in Chicago. Thinking of another show from maybe 10 years or so ago was the Massive Change, this big show that Bruce Mal did that opened in Vancouver, I think, or anyway, in Canada, and then traveled around a bit. Again, the kind of mobilization of this amazing imagery, and of course we live in this era of big data and just the kind of snowing people with just quantity, maybe again has some value in terms of people having to react to it. It's not something that you can feel neutral about, but I don't know. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what the best way, if this is the best way to engage the public or not.
Hi. One strain I read through your presentation, and even though it wasn't maybe said explicitly, but something I think about too, is maybe a history of research that really values and is propelled by collective energies of people, groups of people, in that kind of gain strength in mass in terms of disseminating ideas and shifting discourse and pedagogy and just architecture at large, versus kind of moving towards, and maybe from the Beaux-Arts, even through Learning from Las Vegas, even though maybe that's a small group, it still had the ambitions of a kind of manifesto of a big change that it was driving. Versus a more recent shift that really seems to, at least in the academic setting, favor the individual pursuit over these larger collectives. I mean, for example, even though we talk about labs, which are these small groups, the idea of Columbia as being 14 labs versus a school like the Bauhaus, or a school like these kind of places that bred a kind of larger collective mindset, or this kind of manifesto idea. So I just wonder if you can respond to that.
No, that's a really great point. I think there is built into the idea of a research lab or research setting an idea of collaboration, an idea of teamwork that certainly was intended to challenge the kind of Beaux-Arts genius, creative artist model that had been so dominant. And I think in various of its iterations, we see how effective really that kind of team operation is. I was talking about Conrad Wachsman. He so valued, the input from his students and even the camaraderie, the kind of working together in producing something and the satisfaction that came from that. And I think that's very fair, and I think it can be connected to a research culture and has been in different contexts over time. I'm not sure it always is these days. It seems like research units or centers are often now formed around some central figure whose work it is, who are getting the big funding, and I don't know, but I think it's worth thinking about the project of collaboration in relation to any research project.
Yeah, or I guess, just kind of unification versus fragmentation.
Yeah. I think more and more today we see an effort to understand knowledge production as a collective enterprise. In architectural history, for example, one thing that I'm confronted with and been struggling with is the whole issue of globalization and the necessity to rewrite our architectural history in a global context. But at the same time, being unable to claim any expertise for, so much knowledge that pertains to places that are outside my own experience or my own training. And so the need to understand what I'm doing as part of a larger project, a collective project where knowledge is being pooled. And from that standpoint, I think our new technology is just, an amazing resource enabling that. At the same time, we also have issues with, judgment criteria and how we can assess things that are coming from places that we don't know as intimately as well. So, but it's definitely an important issue linked to the one I've been talking about.
Hi. I know that you spoke sort of about questioning the intention behind research in architecture, and I kind of wanted to kind of go a little bit further and talk about it kind of going into architecture and practice as how things in research is sort of like the start of that movement or something like that. With the Beaux-Arts style, it just was sort of the relearning of classical architecture and stuff that kind of brought those into forms that we see a lot today. But how is the research that is kind of going on? I mean, it seems like it does sort of stop at the educational level now more so, or I mean, I just see architecture, while we're kind of building today, it seems like it's sort of a minority of those sort of ideas are actually being produced, where I guess maybe because the buildings that have lasted before were all of those examples that you kind of look back to, but what sort of ideas are kind of pushing through into actual practice.
I'm not sure I know how to respond to that. I mean, if one of the things you're getting at is the difference between the culture of schools and the culture of offices or practice, I think, I mean, there are certain offices that seem to be dedicating, you know, part of their operations to research, so maybe there is some continuity with academia in that respect, but I'm not sure I'm answering your question. No, I may not have understood.
Like, I mean, I've spent a lot of time in architectural education and everything like that, and actually going into, I work in more preservation now, and I'm kind of preserving those sort of classical architectural elements of the past, but it doesn't seem to be like there is I mean, working with developers that are creating things today, at least in Buffalo, it doesn't seem to be like that research is really permeating into the built space as much as those classical elements have been continued out through history. So I just, like, you see kind of all of the exhibitions and even like the interest in like sort of the anthropological side of architecture, like looking at other forms as interesting or modern or something like that, but whether it's actually permeating into new build works, it doesn't, I don't see it as much.
Right.
And it's just because we've been collecting that architectural past and kind of keeping it, but I'm just kind of a little disheartened by the research in academia staying there and not being so much pushed into the trade.
Yeah, well, causes to think, I mean, what would it take to make a historic preservation project resonate with some of that thought or that knowledge, you know, beyond just the kind of completion of, I don't know.
I'm just thinking, like, what sort of buildings today are we creating that we're going to be preserving in 200 years?
Yeah. I don't know. That's another question. I don't know.
Yes, I would just make an observation that you can look downstairs. There's some interesting photographs of Peter Banham and his students in the 1970s. I guess he didn't call it a lab, but this institution was very important for discovering, I would say, the value of industrial architecture, especially in this city.
Yeah.
And Peter was the leading light of that, and he took his students around. There's some great photographs downstairs, and that's a very concrete example, I think, of how a lab, or whatever you want to call it, a studio, going off not to some far land, but right in the same city where the institution is, and how it affected not only architecture here, but elsewhere as well.
Or just a kind of serious study, really deep knowledge of structures and technology, as opposed to the critique he makes in Theory and Design in the First Machine Age is that the architects of the first machine age, the modern movement, were you know, excited by the spirit of the new technology, but they didn't really get deep into it, know it very well. It's why Buckminster Fuller kind of emerges as the Deus Ex Machina at the end of the book, because Fuller did, in fact, really understand the technology he was trying to use, as opposed to just doing window dressing, pipe railings and porthole windows and images of technology, rather than a kind of depth understanding of it.
Yes.
Yeah, so Banham certainly represents that.
Since you brought up the conversation that exhibition is about, so what a lot of the focus from the symposium that we had around Rainer Banham's teaching focused on his interest in fieldwork, and you also brought up fieldwork and even showed that great image of a few women scattered in there in the landscape architecture department at Berkeley. So the distinction between or just the question of what constitutes field work, and somebody, Mustafa, who's here today, also brought up the difference between field work and what the architecturism model and that discussion, which I think so what you brought up resonates really well with the what Banham's pedagogy, at least as we discussed it a few weeks ago, was trying to kind of contest. And though I wouldn't necessarily think of his studio as a lab, I almost think of it as the anti-research model, prevalent at that time in the late 70s, of trying to take the knowledge from field to create a dialogue between the field and the classroom, so that there wasn't the distinction that now Thomas is talking about, that you don't know how it translates further, how the historical material can be actualized in the future, say reuse of buildings or the creation of new buildings. What happens to these structures in their afterlife as ideas and in practice?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think the question of translation is fundamental. I mean, you collect all this stuff, you come back from Las Vegas with all these marvelous photographs and make grids with, where you lay out the information in some rational looking way, and then what? How do you then take that knowledge and use it for design purposes? If that's your work, if you're a designer, how do you translate knowledge into your project? Yeah. Sorry.
Thank you. This was a terrific presentation. I have just a general question. Most of the examples that you provided were faculty members of large research institutions. So it was in the United States. And so my question is this a systemic problem in architecture schools, or is it a general critique of higher education right now, where we place our values? Less towards education and more towards research.
Yeah, well, I talk a little bit about this in this little piece called Slash, but certainly the social sciences and the hard sciences have always had these research cultures and have been very geared to funding and getting funding from various sources. And I think architecture has been a kind of latecomer to that table, but now we're here, and especially I think in an age where environmental issues are so front and center, there are a number of issues that we work on that are eminently fundable and belong to this culture. But I think that now, some of us are behaving more like, what cancer researchers did in the 30 years ago. We kind of are mastering those same techniques for getting financed and funded for what we do.
I mean, I think in general, sort of the I've tracked sort of some other this sort of studies fields because of my research, but education studies went through a similar thing where it was all about history and sort of theory, pedagogic theory, and now it's sort of completely this kind of quantitative research, and there are only a handful of historians to sort of, and it just sort of every time I go to their conference, there's this like talk about kind of value-free kind of research sort of thing. But then the other part of it is like how design got sort of co-opted. This version of design that I'm not so sure if it kind of contributed as an institution to kind of produce, but got co-opted into university level as this kind of design thinking, which is sort of this, almost is like finding this like conflict-free, shiny solutions to problems, so that once you kind of put this kind of three disciplines together. And I just sort of feel like we were kind of better at kind of finding conflicts and kind of revealing them, but then when you're sort of working at that level, or sort of this kind of transdisciplinary space, there's this expectation that the architectural solutions will amount to this kind of like iPhone, this sort of everything is neatly packaged. And I just sort of feel that that really kind of puts us as a sort of a disadvantage, because I don't think we know how to do that really well. I don't think it's also kind of not a maybe worthy pursuit, actually.
Yeah. Of course, I think we're also seeing the influence of Silicon Valley and that whole design intelligence world is also filtering into architecture schools. Yeah.
Just to follow up on some of that, I wonder if some of the questions that are coming up now and in your presentation have to do with this call, both in the recent NAB reformulation, but also before that, for a kind of standard rigorous methodology. Because when I think about like architecturism, and I think about what Koolhaas did in Lagos, and if we connect that back to sort of Le Corbusier's tour of the East and others, like this is sort of, in my estimation anyway, bad travelogue kind of research. When we actually have fields that tell us how to do ethnography, I mean, when we look at the serious material science research that's happening in architecture, there's a model in the sciences for that purpose, as opposed to one that's being generated within architecture. And so I wonder if the issue that architects are having now is that either they're trying to generate some kind of stabilized standards for themselves for this work, or that it just seems kind of like a free-for-all kind of, like if you can convince somebody to give you money, you're doing research, but otherwise then you're not doing research. And like to me, the methodology piece seems to be not as rigorous in architecture, and that there's a kind of plurality that is allowed there instead of the rigor that's required to say what's happening here is peer-reviewed, it's acknowledged that this is a kind of standard way of doing it. And I say this because like there's also folks who are talking about the bifurcation now that's happening between history theory and the rise of really innovative PhD research, which is taking this methodology to new places.
Yeah.
And then the kind of experimentation that's happening in studio that's being called research, but I have a hard time getting people to tell me what are the standards of that research and what makes it common and transferable from one space to another.
Yeah. No, I think you make a great point. Look, we're up against an impossible situation. If the studio trip takes place over, say, spring break for 1 week, or maybe gets extended to 2 weeks in many schools, what can be absorbed, in that space of time. It's, and given the incredible density of the architecture curriculum, what students have to, do in the space of a semester, how much can they be expected to really engage, immerse, and so on. But you're right. I mean, maybe in certain quarters we're heading toward some standards, some more rigorous kinds of methodology. Yeah, I hope so.
Okay, I think with that we should thank you. There was a fantastic presentation.
Thank you.